My name is Humphrey Tonkin, and I'm sitting here with Ulrich Lins, who was one of the contributors to the Soros Lecture Series that we did recently, a series that dealt with various aspects of Esperanto and planned languages. And among our various speakers was the German historian Ulrich Lins. Ulrich, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about your lecture and also about your work. Could you tell us a little bit about the subject that you dealt with in your lecture? I know this has been an interest of yours for many years. Mm-hmm. Could you say a few words about the topics you covered in your lecture?
Yes, in my lecture I tried to answer the question why Esperanto was considered dangerous. Mm. I briefly summarized the main features of the persecutions in Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union under Stalin and tried to show the differences of the anti-Esperanto attitudes of these two regimes.
What drew you to this subject, the question of the persecution of Esperanto speakers?
I learned Esperanto in 1958, and I knew early on Hitler's condemnation of Esperanto in Mein Kampf. Uh-huh. This quotation in Mein Kampf had electrified me very early on. More than 50 years ago, when I was a history student at the University of Cologne, I noticed by chance that an anniversary was imminent. Mm-hmm. The 30th return of the ban of the German Esperanto Association by the Nazi regime. Uh-huh. At first I hardly found any material on this. Older German Esperantists whom I questioned showed a strange shyness to express themselves at all on the subject and to reveal personal memories.
So how difficult was it to gather the material that you needed?
My first topic was Esperanto in the Third Reich. Mm-hmm. Because of this anniversary. Yeah. I went through the magazines of the German Esperanto Association, but early on I also evaluated the Gestapo files in the Federal Archives in Koblenz. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I knew that Esperantists also had also been persecuted in the Soviet Union, but for a long time I did not dare to approach this topic. Contacts to survivors in the Soviet Union could not be established. I got no answer to questions. Mm-hmm. Soviet Esperanto magazines from the pre-war period were of great use, which the publisher Theo Jung, Heroldo de Esperanto, left to me. And since the beginning of the 70s, the contact to a Japanese ex-communist and a long-time Esperantist, Kurisuke, mm-hmm. Was very enlightening. Kurisuke made clear to me the importance of the personal correspondence of Soviet Esperantists with foreign countries until the middle of the 30s. As a result of my studies, the book La Dangera Lingua, The Dangerous Language, appeared in 1988 in Germany, and 2 years later it was republished by Progress in Moscow. That was 3 years after Gorbachev took power. Uh-huh. A revised edition came out in 2015. It benefited from German reunification and the changes in Eastern Europe. I was able to evaluate further Gestapo files at the Federal Archives in Berlin and also profit a little from the temporary partial opening of Soviet archives, KGB archives.
Yes, yes. Now, initially, as I understand it, Esperanto was seen as an asset in spreading the word of the revolution by the communists. But then the situation changed. What caused it to change?
Esperanto was indeed seen in the early Soviet Union as a means of promoting world revolution.
Mm-hmm.
There was no encouragement from the side of the party, from the side of party officials. It had an inhibitory effect that Marx and Engels had taught that premature, overzealous cosmopolitanism was not conducive to the revolutionary ultimate goal, and indeed distracted from the class struggle. In the difficult initial phase of the Soviet Union, on the other hand, outside support was welcome. Since many pro-Soviet leftists in the world had been seized by the enthusiasm for Esperanto, the idea of using it to support the Soviet Union was obvious. Contradictions were present from the beginning, and they intensified with the Soviet Union turning away from the goal of world revolution. With the strong domestic orientation and the intensifying bunker mentality, the Esperanto movement got more and more into a marginal existence in the Soviet Union. The Esperantists cheered up the world revolution until the end, and thus came into a dangerous contradiction to Stalinism, which tried to prevent any foreign contact, even the one that seemed ideologically conformist. Only long after the war it became obvious that the popularity of Esperanto in practice, especially its usefulness in gaining a knowledge of the non-Soviet world, ultimately exposed their language and movement to persecution. To persecutions whose extent was even greater than the oppression in the Third Reich. So
essentially, I guess the Esperantists were a little too enthusiastic about the revolution, and Stalin eventually then moved against them, which only caused them to become even more enthusiastic about the revolution, thereby exposing themselves completely. So, although Stalin essentially buried the Esperanto movement in Russia, after his death in the 1950s, the language began to re-emerge, both in the Soviet Union itself and also in the satellite countries. What made Esperanto acceptable again to the authorities?
Esperanto never actually became acceptable in the Soviet bloc, even after Stalin's death. But after 1956 it was no longer persecuted. It was still viewed with suspicion. In some of the satellite states, new freedoms could be used, also as a result of the ruling powers' realization that Esperanto could be used to advertise the new socialist people's democracies, new socialist states, Bulgaria, for instance, or Poland. China is a special case. There the Esperanto movement came to silence for a very short period, for a very short time under Soviet pressure at the beginning of the 50s, but then recovered strongly. During the Cultural Revolution, many Esperantists were persecuted, and that was paradoxical because the use of Esperanto for state propaganda, for the dissemination of Mao Zedong's ideas, continued unabated.
And of course that was an interesting period, one way or another, a really chaotic period, also ideologically in various ways. So, just to come back to Stalin, while Stalin was opposed to Esperanto as a manifestation of so-called cosmopolitanism, the situation in Germany was a little bit different, because Hitler saw Esperanto as part of the international Jewish conspiracy. But for the most part, if I understand it rightly, Esperantists tended to get persecuted because they were Jews rather than because they were Esperantists. And non-Jewish Esperantists were simply dissuaded from continuing to support Esperanto. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. However, the ideological ultimate goal of the Nazis must not be overlooked. In the center for them was the fight against Jewish illusions of reconciliation between peoples, quotation, which also served Esperanto. The Nazis continued their surveillance of the movement also in Allied countries. And while the Holocaust was already at its height, put repressive measures against the Esperantists in Hungary or Italy on hold for the period after a victorious war. The ideological obsession is reflected in the fact that the SS, as soon as the Wehrmacht had occupied Warsaw in early 1939, specifically searched for members of the Zamenhof family in Warsaw.
In fact, that's really an extraordinary story. Namely that as soon as the Nazis arrived in Warsaw, they rounded up the members of the Zamenhof family, the founders of Esperanto. So indeed, I think you're right, that there was a kind of obsession about Esperanto. But now, what was the effect of the Holocaust on the Esperanto movement in general?
So the Esperantists knew, of course, that Zamenhof was a Jew. But like Zamenhof, they never particularly emphasized his Judaism. At first, they did not take Hitler's enmity seriously. It was more important for most bourgeois Esperantists to distance themselves from attempts by the left to seize Esperanto. Especially from abuse by communists, and to keep Esperanto as far away from politics as possible. Only after the war, after the Second World War, did they recognize the terrible consequences of anti-Semitism. They drew the lesson that political neutrality, as traditionally upheld by the Esperanto movement, was inappropriate, even immoral, in the face of an inhuman ideology, and contradicted the legacy of Zamenhof.
Well, now, you and I worked together on translating your study of the international persecution of Esperantists into English. And the translation into English was by no means the first translation. Can you tell us a little bit about translations of the book?
I myself provided a German version of the book. A Japanese translation was published as early as 1975, and translations into Italian, Russian, Lithuanian, Korean, and English followed later.
It's really quite remarkable, one way or another. Now, the book's also gone through several different editions, right?
Yes.
In fact, you've been occupied with this study for much of your career as a historian. But you've also done a whole collection of other things. What are some of the other things you've done as a historian?
Well, my doctoral dissertation dealt with a Japanese movement, Omoto, which also had something to do with Esperanto, but which interested me especially because of the tension between nationalism and internationalism. 40 years ago, I worked in a collection volume on Germany and Japan. A little later, I was co-editor of a 12-volume work on Germany today, and after the reunification of 3 volumes on the United Germany. The collaboration on the latter works was primarily of an organizational nature. I addressed German authors. We had also Japanese authors, but I addressed German authors whose contributions, as well as my own, were then translated into Japanese.
You know, the remarkable thing about this is that you did all of this while holding down a full-time job. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, before I could start an academic career, I received an offer that I could not refuse, an offer to set up an office in Tokyo for the German Academic Exchange Service, DAAD. That is, I did not enter a university for an academic career, but dealt with the academic exchange between Germany and foreign countries and other countries. I worked for the DAAD for 30 years in Tokyo and in Bonn. And I had a lot to do with Asia, not least through travel, but also with Eastern Europe, which was particularly appealing to me because of the links I mentioned earlier with the Soviet Union.
So you were really able to combine your professional career with your interests as a historian.
In fact,
which is wonderful. But now, what do you see as the future of the study of the history of Esperanto, and why is it important?
The history of Esperanto has for a long time received little attention. That has changed only recently. And I believe this has something to do with globalization, which is increasingly shaping our lives today. As a result, interest in a transnational view of history has also increased. It is not surprising that Esperanto comes into view, a language that has lived for many decades despite fierce resistance. Andreas Wirsching, the director of the Institute of Contemporary History in Munich, recently pointed out that in the context of the history of communist transnationalism, the Esperanto movement deserves more attention.
So what lessons would you like us to take away from your study of the persecution of Esperanto speakers? How does the book speak to us today?
My concern was to show that Esperanto developed a strong potential early on to defy the persistent forces of nationalism. It was a bearer of cosmopolitanism from below. 100 years ago, Esperanto approached recognition by the League of Nations. The efforts failed, just like the fight against racial discrimination or Wilson's 14 points. Up to the time of the persecutions under Hitler and Stalin, the language and movement could develop, and also afterwards again.
Yeah.
But even today, old enmities still flicker from time to time. For example, in a connection with conspiracy theories that target rootless internationalism. And in doing so, also bring George Soros, the son of a well-known Esperantist, into a current reference to Esperanto.
So the fact is that everything connects with everything else. And you know, what I find really interesting about the work that you've done is that it's both typical in that it tells us some really important things about the nature of persecution, the nature of idealism, the nature of social movements in the 20th century. And it's also a unique story. There's nothing quite like it. And I think that combination is both winning and also very much an example. So I want to thank you, Ulrich, very much for your comments, and also for the lecture itself. And I wish you every success in your continuing career as a historian.
Thank you very much, also for your translation.